I would just like to, yeah, those are three talks, which I just feel like I have an awful lot of questions I've been kind of jotting down. And yeah, would love to talk just further about like all of these topics. We have until 4:30. So just I wanted to open the floor first to questions, and actually we have one already that I'm going to read out now. So Mohit says, thanks for that very interesting presentation, Natalia. I would like to ask that Jean-Luc Nancy, in his Creation of the World or Globalization, also raises similar issues about losing connections under the reinforced connectivity brought on by globalization. Do you see the new normal of abandonment as a manifestation of the political, as Arendt observes in totalitarianism, or the economic, as Nancy observes in globalization, or is it both? The question is in the chat if we want to kind of look at it again here. So yeah.
Thank you for this great question, and thank you for turning my attention to this work of Nancy, which unfortunately I'm not familiar, so I would rather be biased, and I would side with Arendt, I think, on this. I will get also to this work of Jean-Luc Nancy. So for Arendt, this abandonment would be a rather manifestation of the political. It starts for her in education. She says that we as instructors, as educators, starting from kindergarten, we should not, or especially in universities, we should not instruct young children or young adults in the art of living, in the art of getting a career or getting skills, but our responsibility is to show them how the world is, because children are born into this world that is pre-configured by the living and the dead, and they should take the responsibility for that, what exists before them. So we should prepare them for the world of adults. And instead, Arendt says, we give autonomy to the world of childhood, where children are debarred from adult life. They're emancipated from the authority of adults under the pretext of respecting child's authority, a child's independence. We have lost the authority in the world of education. They are kept in their own world, so to say, and that breaks up for her the tradition, the link between the grown-up world and the child world. And as a result, when they grow up, according to Arendt, they succumb to a much more tyrannical authority, that of the majority, which nowadays politically can be manipulated, swayed by propaganda. So this loss of authority, this trust in authority in education, for her leads to loss of authority and distrust of authority in politics. So she would say that economical perhaps is derivative of this, of the political, and because she chooses to see the political as acting together in the shared public space, and that is for her not dependent on the economic. That would be my understanding of her.
Thank you very much. Interesting question and interesting answer. Okay. I just a few more questions moving on. So Jackie said, can you show the reading list again, please? And I don't know whether that is, I'm sure people have seen it. I don't know whether that is directed at Amanda and Nayada. And I was wondering, maybe you can show each other, but that's more or show it on here possibly, but sorry, I feel like that's more a logistical rather than a sort of a theoretical question, so I might move on to Lisa's question for Amanda and Nayada. I'd be interested to hear you talk a bit more about the terminology classified under logos for Fox News. Were these terms largely similar to the logos terms for CNN? As you said, one would expect more pathos to be associated with Fox News due to the role of emotional appeal in misinformation and far-right rhetoric. But perhaps because you're dealing with written sources, as you mentioned, there is less space for emotional hyperbole. Interesting, I was going to ask a similar thing, actually, yeah, so... It's just, yeah,
Hi.
Amanda.
Okay. Yes. Sorry. Yes. So it was very interesting. In my preparatory research, there was a lot written about this phenomenon of Fox News because they've been very much in the spotlight recently, especially as concerns that legal suit over misinformation during the pandemic. So what we did find, in fact, was that they were far less inflammatory, uh, far less combative, pugnacious, misleading, or I suppose there was less opportunity for that sort of rhetoric to be present in the written sources that we analyzed. And the logos terms were the same. All of the terms we analyzed were the same between CNN and Fox News. What we did was we generated a list of the top 200 most common words for that first step, and then culled that list by a criteria of what showed up in both relatively often. So for Fox News, what ended up, I think, contributing to that logos score, and what we counted as logos, were sentences wherein the term in question was used just to describe, basic events, sort of a policy if it was discussed. And what Fox News does in their articles, their written articles, is they have a very banal discussion of this. For instance, I would like to point out that you know, Trump was mentioned, I think, about 7 times in the 10 articles by CNN, but 0 times by Fox News. They avoided, for the most part, any kind of instance, I suppose, where you would see an inflammation or sort of that rhetoric we're used to seeing on the television from them. Uh, Overall, we found that the articles were much more subdued, much more banal, as I kind of noticed. It was surprising. I wasn't anticipating that, but I think it has to do with the fact that, as Nayara mentioned, while we're watching somebody talk about something, even in addition to perhaps presenting misinformation, we're also becoming just like, that's not right. What are you saying? And it's they have a Fox news anchors are very well known for their rhetorical style. They're very combative. They're very divisive. This has been documented by rhetoric scholars like Centel, talking about just it's how they do things. But this wasn't actually very present in their written media. It was very interesting finding, actually. That's what I'll say about that. I hope I answered it.
That's a really intelligent answer. Cool. Thank you so much. Does anybody else have any questions? Oh, Katrina, I see you raising your hand there. Can I ask you to? Yeah, cool.
Yeah. So I have a question for Natalia and Robert. Curiously, because the 2 papers were so different to one another, but both papers were about the relationship between together and apart in very different ways. So Arendt's version of togetherness, community as the basis for political action, Verlassenheit, being apart, as the basis for bad politics. And then Robert's depiction of also a version of together and apart, but happening internally, where we're looking at the relationship between different parts of ourselves. And you were suggesting to us that a kind of an embrace, a together approach to ourselves was the healthier one. And my question, as opposed to my speech, is really whether actually these 2 approaches might connect up with one another, or to ask you, is there a sense in which Arendt might understand the role of where her politics actually also has a conception of suffering, of individual suffering, of understanding suffering as a political category, And conversely then, whether for Robert, that kind of internal dynamic of embracing or rejecting part of ourselves also translates into politics in the public realm. Thank you.
Well, I could briefly say that for Arendt, the basis upon which we can act in a shared public space to act together in this common world should be knowledge that is our lived knowledge, the not theoretical knowledge, but the experience one has lived through. So in that respect, suffering can illuminate, suffering through an experience can illuminate the understanding of the world as it is. And there she talks about amor mundi, despite the pain and the suffering that is necessarily part of this world, in these, through this pain and suffering, we'll learn how to love this world as it is. And we come into this world not with a desire to make it perfect, better, or to change it, but to desire with the purpose of creating something new. She talks about natality. And amor mundi, so love of the world as it is, can come through this lived experience and suffering. So that would definitely be a bridge, I think, with what Robert might say.
Does anybody else have any more questions just before I ask one shortly? Okay, I'll go ahead and then you can think in your heads if anybody else has anything more. But I just had a question for Natalia about I think you like used the words like solitude, loneliness, and isolation kind of variously throughout, and like I wanted to talk about, did you have any views on the kind of like difference between these terms? I know there's sort of like the like alone but not lonely cliche, and then you talk about Arendt's idea of like abandonedness, so that would really suggest like a type of solitude or loneliness. I think you were saying that's how she defines loneliness maybe, but I also would love to just get that reclarified just because I find it interesting. But yeah, like just solitude, loneliness, and isolation, and whether you feel these have like differing significances like at the moment, or
Yes, so isolation for her was obviously not a term that I have found. It is rather a contemporary phenomenon and concept, but you're definitely right. It is important to be careful with the concepts. So she, again, she talked about solitude and the necessity of private space, also in education or in her life. We do need this ability, capacity, and a chance to be able to turn away from the world in order to realize ourselves. So that is, I would guess, positively charged term for loneliness, that solitude, where one has the option of any moment to come back to the world. Loneliness is what I would better translate when she talked about this Verlassenheit, because I read her in German. It's impossible to read German philosophy in translations because so much of it is rooted in the language itself, especially with Heidegger and Arendt. So when she describes this phenomenon of Verlassenheit that is in the 20th century, a political phenomenon, she talks of this abandonness, being radically cut off from connection with others and devoid of optionality, devoid of possibility to just choose by your own volition to bridge it, to end it, to bring an end to it. And isolation, the term that I introduced, is this term that today is brought out by technology, where one is lonely and it is being normalized, and it is under the pretense of connectivity, of being without borders. And this isolation is more in the context of the technological situation today. That's how I use, but I haven't demarcated yet very exactly the difference between the terms loneliness as abandonment of Arendt and isolation of today. That is still for me to figure out how this phenomenon of contemporary isolation is changing, modifying in the moment. But thank you for the question. Yes, it is important.
No, thanks so much. And yeah, it is really interesting kind of that you also acknowledge that those terms might, you know, evolve, or there might even be new words for it in terms of like that kind of uniquely contemporary kind of loneliness, or loneliness as a product of technology or something. But okay, yeah, cool, thanks. I just have loads to think about that. Robert, did you have a question for Katrina's question? I also, yeah, I think I just.
There we go.
Cool.
I do have a question. I had a response to a previous question, but I did have a response to what she just said. They go. I can put them together. So I think in terms of suffering, back to that for a second, question about that. The impulse would be creativity in response to suffering, rather than the removal of suffering, the creativity in response to suffering. Now, creativity is what does that mean? For Jung and his followers, it had to do with I guess common terms would be maybe seeing possibilities that we don't currently see, and that could be a societal thing. So that given boundaries that we had that protected us, if they break down, if we try to reformulate things so that those boundaries protect us, that protects us against the previous structure. It won't work in the future, so we'd have to create into that. So my question now to Natalia, tied to that, would be, what is the role of creativity in harmonious society, according to Arendt?
I would say that as we, according to her, have this distinctive ability to bring forth into existence that which was not there before, this giving birth, creating this natality is our distinctive quality, as opposed to, let's say, animals. This is our definitive characteristic, and our creative attitude towards the world, towards thinking the reality, is necessarily for her the precondition for accessing, thinking any aspects of reality. So the creative, the poesis for her to make, to create, from the original translation from Greek of the word poesis, to make, create, for her was also very important. And she talked a lot about poets, writers, about metaphors, because it creates connections. Metaphor in itself creates connections that were not existing there before. The creation, the poesis of one's active attitude towards world as it is for her, I would say, a responsibility. In her book on responsibility and judgment, she talks about our responsibility to the world as it is. So yes, definitely creativity at the core, I would say.
So I'm sorry to keep talking. So are we all inherently creative, potentially, all of us?
Humans, yes.
Yes.
According to Arendt, yes.
Right. Yeah.
Potentially. We can use that or not avail to that all lifelong, but that is, of course, our choice.
Thank you so much. There's just one final question from Mohit in the chat, a question for Robert again. I thought just while we're talking, how does one determine worth to one's own suffering? Is there an implication of a positive outcome from one's suffering, a shared connection perhaps, which deserves admiration? I see an overlap between Robert's paper and Natalia's paper. So.
Yeah, so I'll share the answer as well. Yeah, I think so. I think there's an overlap for sure. We can have communal suffering. And part of the work for me, I'm also a poet and published a lot. Part for me, part of seeing the suffering communally involves the role of art, because that would move us out of, paradoxically, keep us in our own sense of suffering, but also move us out into others as well. If we see the suffering of a character in literature, yes, we see it there on the page, but we also see it here, and that is the sharing, and that is a communal suffering, and it can be approached. I'm not sure that the creative response, it would be nice if it's, in my country, if the creative response is something is not seemingly not artistic, but a woman who refuses to move to the back of the bus if she's African American. Creative response. I'm not going to do it. But that touched a lot of people in a lot of parallel ways. So I'm thinking that we can have a creative response to suffering, and that an image that takes root in that suffering spawns other images, so that we have multiples that grow out of that one. I'll since Natalia is also involved in that, I'll pass over to her.
Oh, I thought you formulated it pretty succinctly, but the singularity of individual, I think suffering precludes this communal, as you said, connection in suffering. But the fact itself of sharing suffering, that is the common ground on which we can meet. But I think, Robert, you put it succinctly.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. This is okay. Yeah, and Mohit said, thanks for your response, Robert. I agree, communal suffering can be enabling. Okay, that's just like, I'm really happy with just like the breadth of where this discussion has went. So yeah, just thank you so much, everyone. This has been really informative. We will be back again in 15 minutes for our first keynote, Dr. So-Won Park, talking about memory out of bounds. But until then, we will take a short break. So until 4:45. Okay, thank you so much, everybody. I just want, Tom, do you want to also say anything? Yeah.
Yes, just again, to thank you, thank the previous panelists. That was brilliant. Such different talks, but with lots of little overlapping angles. And even for Amanda and Ayar, just the kind of the rigor of that project was just astonishing. But yes, so kind of like before, we'll go on a break until 1:45, and we'll be back for the keynote, which I've been really looking forward to all day. So yeah, see you back then.
Thank you so much, everyone. We'll see you soon.